Welcome back to Real Talk. I'm Josh, and today I want to dive into one of the most fascinating, divisive, and downright bizarre films in David Lynch's entire career, his 1984 adaptation of Dune. Now, if you know anything about Lynch, you know he is a filmmaker who thrives on dreamlike storytelling, eerie soundscapes, and his deeply personal visions. He's the kind of director who can make a simple conversation feel like some sort of unsettling fever dream. When you think of David Lynch, you probably think of Eraserhead, Blue Velvet, Mulholland Drive, Twin Peaks, things like that. Strange, surreal, psychological pieces that stick with you. You probably don't think big budget sci-fi epic based on one of the most complex novels ever written. And yet, in 1984, Lynch found himself at the helm of Dune, a massive Hollywood production that was supposed to be the next Star Wars. Well, spoiler alert, it wasn't. When Dune hit theaters, it was not a success. Critics tore it apart, audiences were baffled, and even Lynch himself practically disowned it. The studio chopped it down, re-edited it, and basically made a movie that Lynch never really considered his own. But despite all of that, Dune has developed this weird and passionate cult following over the years. Some people love it for its sheer ambition, its eerie atmosphere, and of course its unique visual style, while others see it as an overstuffed, incoherent mess. And honestly, I think both perspectives are totally valid for this one. For me, my first experience with Dune was, overwhelming. I had read the book beforehand, so I thought I was prepared. But watching the film for the first time, I felt like getting hit with a sandstorm of exposition. These whispered inner monologues and the surreal imagery felt way more Eraserhead than Star Wars. One minute, we're watching space politics unfold. The next, we're seeing a giant, grotesque floating villain cackle as he spews weird fluids everywhere. It's a movie that really throws a lot at you, and whether that's a good or bad thing really depends on what you're looking for. But here's the thing, despite all its flaws, I still find Dune absolutely fascinating. Because how did we get here? How did David Lynch, a director known for intimate, deeply strange and psychological dramas, end up directing, at the time, one of the most expensive sci-fi films ever? What exactly went wrong behind the scenes? And maybe the biggest question of all, does Dune really deserve the reputation it has today? So let's get into it. Bringing Dune to the big screen was never going to be easy. Frank Herbert's novel is dense, sprawling, and it's packed with complex ideas, and it's far from typical blockbuster material. But Hollywood kept trying. Long before David Lynch got involved, the road to adapting Dune was filled with wild, ambitious, and legendary misfires, and all the behind-the-scenes drama that could make for its own sci-fi epic story. What we eventually got in 1984 was a film that was visually stunning, but also deeply flawed. A movie torn between artistic vision and those studio demands. So to understand how we ended up with Lynch's Dune, we have to look at the chaotic journey that led us there. So before Lynch ever touched Dune, there was Alejandro Jodorowsky, his version of Dune that he attempted to make. This version has become the stuff of legend thanks in part to a really wonderful 2013 documentary, Jodorowsky's Dune. The Chilean-French director, known for surreal and mind-bending films like El Topo and Holy Mountain, both films we covered in our cult films exploration about a year ago, he had this vision for Dune that was beyond anything Hollywood had ever attempted. He didn't just want to make a movie, he wanted to create a full-blown cinematic revolution. Jodorowsky's plan was a 10-hour epic starring Salvador Dali as the Emperor, with a contract demanding $100,000 per minute of screen time, Orson Welles as Baron Harkonnen, who Jodorowsky lured in by promising a personal chef on set, Mick Jagger as Fade Rotha, and a soundtrack was a mix of Pink Floyd and the French prog rock band Magma. I mean, it was ambitious, psychedelic, completely unhinged. Jodorowsky even storyboarded the entire film with the artist Jean Giraud, known as Mobius, and H.R. Giger, who we all know later designed Alien, creating this visionary concept art. But the problem was no studio was willing to finance this version. The budget ballooned and the sheer scope of the project terrified investors. In the end, it all collapsed under its own weight. While the film was never made, its influence is undeniable. Many of the creative team members went on to shape sci-fi classics like Alien, Blade Runner, even The Fifth Element. In a way, Jodorowsky's Dune lived on, just not in the form he originally imagined. So after this version of Dune fell apart, the rights eventually landed with Italian producer Dino De Laurentiis. He's this larger-than-life Hollywood figure known for making bold, expensive films. He had already produced Flash Gordon and the Conan and the Barbarian, so tackling Dune seemed like the next logical big step. De Laurentiis was determined to get Dune made, and he sought out a director who could handle its complexity. Initially, he tried to approach Ridley Scott, who was fresh off Alien, and Scott was interested, but ultimately left the project feeling that it was going to take just too long to develop. So with Scott out, De Laurentiis turned to his next choice, David Lynch, an unconventional choice considering Lynch being known for surreal, intimate films, so far having made Eraserhead and Elephant Man. At the time, Lynch had never read Dune, but De Laurentiis dangled a major opportunity in front of him, the chance to write and direct a massive sci-fi epic. Notably, Lynch turned down Return of the Jedi to take on Dune, believing he'd have more creative freedom, and ironically that turned out not to be the case. From the very beginning, Dune was an uphill battle. Lynch faced monumental task of condensing Herbert's dense, multi-layered novel into a 2-hour movie. And that alone would have been difficult, but studio interference made it even harder. Universal Pictures wanted Dune to be the next Star Wars, a commercially viable blockbuster that could appeal to the masses. Lynch, however, had something weirder, more experimental in mind. And the struggle played out in the editing room. The first cut of Dune was reportedly over 4 hours long, packed with Lynch's signature dreamlike sequences and his bizarre imagery. Universal, however, demanded it be cut down significantly, leading to a rushed and often incoherent theatrical version. Important character development was lost, voiceover narration was added to explain the plot points, and entire subplots were either trimmed or just removed completely. And Lynch had little or no control over that final edit. By the time Dune hit theaters in 1984, it was a completely compromised vision. It still had a mix of Lynch's surreal style, but it also had a studio desperately trying to shape it into a crowd pleaser. And the result? A film that looks incredible, but often feels disjointed and inaccessible. When it finally did get released, Dune bombed at the box office. It received scathing reviews. Critics and audiences alike found it confusing, slow, and overly reliant on exposition. Even Lynch himself was notably unhappy with the final product. In later interviews, he distanced himself from Dune, saying it was not his film due to the heavy studio interference. He even refused to do a director's cut, something that fans have hoped for years. Instead, extended TV cuts were made without his involvement, sometimes replacing his name with the infamous Hollywood pseudonym Alan Smithy, a signal that a director has disowned a project. Despite its failure, though, Dune has gained something of a cult following over the years. Some still admire its bold visual design, the haunting score that ended up being done by Toto, and the really unique atmosphere. Others see it as an ambitious failure, an example of what happens when an auteur collides with blockbuster expectations. Either way, Lynch's Dune remains one of the most fascinating and controversial sci-fi films ever made, a movie defined as much by its troubled production as by what ended up on the screen. So David Lynch's Dune is one of the most fascinatingly strange sci-fi adaptations ever made. It's a film that exists in a weird space. It's part epic blockbuster, part surreal dreamscape, and part incomprehensible mess, all depending on who you ask. On the surface, it's a space opera about warring factions and a young hero's journey. But beneath that, Lynch infused it with his signature themes: dream logic, body horror, and an unsettling sense of destiny. Watching Dune can feel like being dropped in the deep end of the pool with no warning. You either sink, swim, or just let the strange, hypnotic waves carry you along. So let's take a moment and break down what actually happens in Dune and how Lynch's vision shapes that story. Starting with what actually happens. Well, a lot actually happens. And also, sometimes it feels like nothing at all. So, at its core, the story follows Paul Atreides, played by Kyle MacLachlan, in his first of many collaborations with Lynch, the young nobleman whose family is sent to oversee the desert planet Arrakis. Arrakis isn't just any planet, it's the only place in the universe where the spice melange is found, a substance that fuels interstellar travel, extends life, and even grants psychic abilities. This makes Arrakis the most valuable planet in existence, which naturally means that controlling it is a deadly game. The Atreides family is stepping into a trap set by their rivals, the Harkonnens, with the secret backing of the Emperor himself. From the moment they arrive, betrayal is brewing. Duke Leto Atreides, Paul's father, is assassinated. Paul and his mother, Lady Jessica, are forced to flee into the desert, where they take refuge with the Freemen, who are the indigenous people of the Arrakis. Paul, through a mix of survival prophecy and a hefty dose of spice-induced visions, he begins to embrace his role as the Freemen's long-awaited messianic leader. And what follows is a slow transformation. Paul shifts from a privileged noble heir to a hardened warrior, and eventually something even more powerful and dangerous. Now, Dune is this dense novel, and Lynch's vision condenses it to just over 2 hours. So the result is a film packed with so much exposition that it sometimes feels like you're listening to an audiobook rather than watching a movie. Lynch uses whispered inner monologues to cram in details that would otherwise take pages to explain. The film constantly tells you what characters are thinking, sometimes effectively, sometimes awkwardly, but it also adds to that dreamlike, detached quality that makes Dune feel different from other sci-fi films of its time. Now, one of the more fascinating aspects of the film is how it bends the source material to fit Lynch's signature style. If you strip away the spaceships and sandworms, you're left with a classic Lynch film, themes of duality, surreal dream sequences, some grotesque horror, and an underlying sense of unease. So let's start with the duality, because Paul is trapped between two identities, his noble upbringing and his destiny with the Freeman. He's constantly torn between who he was supposed to be and who he's becoming. And this idea of transformation, of someone shedding their former self to become something new, that's at the heart of many of Lynch's films. Just like we'll see with Jeffrey Beaumont in Blue Velvet, Agent Cooper down the road in Twin Peaks, Paul is thrust into a hidden world where nothing is quite what it seems. And then there's the dream logic. Lynch loved using dreams and visions to communicate deeper truths, and Dune is packed filled with them. Paul experiences fragmented glimpses of the future, surreal moments where time and space seem to collapse in on themselves. These dream sequences, often washed in blue light, filled with cryptic whispers and abstract imagery, they feel less like traditional sci-fi prophecy and more like the eerie symbolic dreams that were found in Eraserhead or will be found in Mulholland Drive. And of course, there's the body horror. The grotesque Baron Harkonnen is one of the most overtly Lynchian elements in the film. He's covered in boils, oozing with infection, and floating around in a way that it's both comical and unsettling. He feels more like a creature from Eraserhead than a standard sci-fi villain. Lynch doesn't shy away from the grotesque. The Baron's physical decay mirrors his corruption, and it adds an extra layer of horror that isn't pronounced in the other versions of Dune. But where Dune struggles most is in balancing Lynch's signature mood with the sheer amount of information that it needs to convey. Lynch is a master of atmosphere. His best films aren't about plot mechanics, they're about feelings, about creating an experience that sticks to your subconscious. But with Dune, he's forced to spend so much time explaining the intricacies of spice, prophecy, and the galactic politics that there's very little room left for that signature Lynchian weirdness to fully breathe. Instead of letting the world unfold naturally, the film just bombards us with whispered voiceovers, the long-winded explanations, and characters just staring into space as they narrate their thoughts. It's an attempt to condense a deeply complex story into a more digestible format, but it often makes the film feel strangely detached. There are moments of brilliance, haunting visuals, eerie sound design, the unsettling performances, but they're constantly interrupted by exposition dumps that really break the film's flow. That said, when Dune works, it really works. Some of the film's most striking moments aren't the battles or action sequences, but the quiet, hypnotic ones. The eerie stillness of the desert, Paul's trance-like visions, and the deep rumbling of approaching sandworms, Lynch was able to find beauty in the strange and the unsettling. And when the film leans into that, it becomes something truly unique. So Lynch's Dune is a fascinating contradiction. It's both ambitious and restrained, deeply personal but oddly impersonal, visually stunning yet narratively clunky. It's a film that doesn't quite fit into any category, because it's not a straightforward sci-fi epic. It's also not fully a Lynch film in the way something like Lost Highway or Fire Walk With Me is. For some, that makes Dune a very frustrating watch. Too weird for mainstream audiences, too constrained for Lynch fans. But for others, it's precisely that weirdness that makes it so compelling. It is a flawed, fascinating experience. It's a glimpse into what happens when one of cinema's most unique directors tries to mold a sprawling sci-fi epic into something dreamlike, unsettling and still utterly his own. And while Lynch himself may have disowned the film, there's no denying that Dune, love it or hate it, still holds a strange and hypnotic power. Alright, let's take a few moments and get into the performances and the technical elements of Dune, because there is a lot to unpack here. This film is, as we talked about, an interesting mix of some serious theatrical acting, there's over-the-top camp, and some genuinely odd choices that somehow work, or at least make the movie more memorable. So since this was a big-budget sci-fi epic, you'd expect the performances to be polished and commanding, but Dune takes a different approach. Some of the actors bring weight and gravitas, while others seem to be in a completely different movie. And then there's the technical side. Lynch's surreal visuals, ambitious, sometimes questionable special effects, and a surprisingly fantastic score. So let's break it all down. First, we've got Kyle MacLachlan in his first major role as Paul Atreides. Now, as we all know, MacLachlan would go on to deliver some truly legendary performances. Blue Velvet, Twin Peaks, Showgirls. Well, maybe not that one. But here you can tell he's still figuring things out. He's got the regal look and the quiet intensity needed for Paul, but at times his delivery feels stiff, like he's reciting Shakespeare in a high school play. To his credit, as Paul evolves from an unsure young noble to the prophesied leader, MacLachlan really does a solid job capturing that transformation. But let's be honest, he was just a fresh-faced newcomer trying to carry a sprawling, complicated epic, and it really kind of shows. And then there's Sting as Fade Rotha. Where do we even begin? I mean, he barely has any lines, but he doesn't need him. His performance is pure presence. Wild-eyed, sneering, strutting around in that infamous metal Speedo. It is completely absurd, but in a way that works perfectly for the character. Fade is supposed to be this sadistic, arrogant showman, and Sting plays him exactly that way. Is it good acting? Who cares? It is iconic. On the more seasoned side of the cast, we've got some heavy hitters. Francesca Annis as Lady Jessica brings a quiet and regal strength to her role. Patrick Stewart, about 5 years before Star Trek, plays Gurney Halleck with the kind of stern intensity that you'd expect from a Shakespearean-trained actor, even when he's charging into battle with a pug in his arms, because that happens. Max von Sydow as Dr. Kynes gives the film a sense of legitimacy, as he always does. But the real MVP of Dune is Kenneth McMillan as Baron Harkonnen. He's grotesque, vile, completely unhinged, and Lynch leans all the way into the horror of that character, making the Baron a repulsive, floating monstrosity covered in the boils, cackling as he commits his atrocities. He is over the top, but it fits that nightmarish tone of the Harkonnen scenes. Now let's take a moment to talk about the visuals, because say what you want about the movie, but it looks incredible most of the time. The cinematography is striking, with vast desert landscapes that make Arrakis feel like a real and desolate world. The film's production design is also top tier, from the gothic industrial nightmare of Gaiety Prime to the grand, almost Egyptian-inspired palaces of House Atreides. Lynch and his team clearly put a lot of effort into making the universe feel tangible and distinct. That said, the special effects are a mixed bag. The practical effects, particularly the sandworms, are still impressive. They feel massive, otherworldly, and genuinely intimidating. But some of the blue screen work, especially the floating Harkonnen scenes, well, they haven't aged as well. The shield fight between Paul and Gurney with those weird, blocky force fields, it looked clunky even back then. There's a charm to the old school effects, but some moments take you out of the movie because they really just don't hold up. And then there's the sound design, which is pure Lynch. He's known already for using sound to create atmosphere and tension, and Dune was no exception. The whispers of the Bene Gesserit, the eerie silence in King moments, and the distorted voices when characters use the voice, it all contributes to the film's dreamlike and unsettling tone. Love it or hate it, the soundscape makes Dune feel unique. But the biggest surprise is the score. And you might not expect a rock band like Toto to handle the music for a sci-fi epic, but they absolutely deliver here. The sweeping orchestral themes give the movie a grand operatic feel, while the synthesizer-heavy tracks add a futuristic edge. It's one of the film's strongest elements, dramatic, haunting, and genuinely memorable. In the end, Dune is this strange mix of theatrical performances, bizarre choices, and ambitious, if not always successful, technical achievements. Some of it works beautifully, some of it unintentionally hilarious, and some of it just feels like Lynch throwing weirdness at the screen just for the sake of it. Love it or hate it, there's no denying. It's a film that leaves an impression. So let's talk about the cultural impact and the legacy the film has left. Because when Dune hit theaters in 1984, it didn't just stumble, it face-planted. Both critics and audiences were baffled. Reviews slammed it as a confusing mess. Fans of Frank Herbert's novel were deeply disappointed, and even Lynch wanted nothing to do with it after all the studio interference mangled his vision. It was a big-budget sci-fi epic that landed with a dull thud, and for years seemed destined to be remembered as nothing more than an ambitious failure. But as with many films that don't find their audience right away, Dune has undergone something of a reevaluation. Over time, it has developed a cult following, with fans who admire its ambition, bizarre visuals, and haunting atmosphere. Some genuinely appreciate its unique vision, while others enjoy it as an entertaining misfire, an oddball relic of the 80s sci-fi filmmaking. In the decades since its release, it has become one of the films that sparks debate. Is it a misunderstood masterpiece, a gloriously weird disaster, or is it just something in between? I think one of the biggest reasons Dune has remained relevant is its sheer distinctiveness. There is simply no other film quite like it. The production design is stunning, full of the grotesque and surreal imagery that feels more like dark fantasy than traditional sci-fi. The performance range from intense to bizarre. And then there's the infamous inner monologue narration, where characters whisper their thoughts in hushed tones. It creates a dreamlike, bewildering effect. These choices make Dune feel alien in a way that few sci-fi films ever have. For years, it was easy to dismiss Dune as overstuffed, confusing, ultimately misguided adaptation. But its cult status has only grown, especially in light of Denis Villeneuve's first two parts of his adaptation, which took a far more faithful approach to Herbert's novel. Many fans of Lynch's version argue that While it may not work as a straightforward adaptation, it succeeds as a fascinating piece of surrealist sci-fi. Villeneuve's Dune is more grounded, more carefully constructed and structured, has invited fresh comparison, and it's prompted viewers to revisit Lynch's film with a new perspective. There's also the undeniable fact that Dune helped launch or solidify the careers of several key figures in Hollywood. Kyle MacLachlan, in his first major role, would go on to become a Lynch regular. Patrick Stewart, fresh off his Shakespearean stage career, would just in a few years become the icon of as Captain Picard. Even Sting's brief over-the-top role remains one of the film's most talked about elements. At the end of the day, whether you view Dune as a misunderstood work of art or a fascinating train wreck, it remains one of, if not the strangest, big-budget sci-fi films ever made. It's the kind of movie that, for better or worse, sticks with you. And while Lynch may have washed his hands of it long ago, fans continue to debate, analyze, and truly celebrate its weird, ambitious, undeniably unique vision. All right, now for the part of the show where I get into my personal thoughts. What worked for me, what didn't, and why Dune is such a weirdly fascinating experience. This is where I'm going to break it down, more conversationally, more casually, less of an analysis, more of gut reaction. Because let's be real, Dune is a film that demands a reaction. Because some love it for its ambition, others find it incomprehensible, and I totally get both sides. Because for me, this is a 6 out of 10. It's not a film I'd ever call great, but it's not a film I can dismiss either. It's this bizarre mix of high concept, sci-fi, the dreamlike visuals, and some really baffling storytelling choices. And yet I still find myself drawn to it. Not in a this is my favorite movie ever kind of way, but in a why can't I stop thinking about this kind of way. It's flawed and messy, but also kind of brilliant in its own strange way. So let's dig into my thoughts. For me, Dune is an absolute paradox of a film. It's deeply flawed, but it's still strangely mesmerizing. A complete mess, yet somehow brilliant in moments. It's one of those movies that I can't say is good in a traditional sense, but I also can't stop thinking about it. And honestly, that's more interesting to me than a movie that's just competently made and forgettable. I mean, this is David Lynch we're talking about. The guy doesn't do normal. And while Dune was clearly a compromised vision, something that's been well documented over the years, you can still see those flashes of his signature style. The eerie dream sequences, those unsettling close-ups, the bizarrely off-kilter performances. I mean, there are times when Dune feels less like a straightforward sci-fi epic and more like one of Lynch's nightmares projected onto a big screen. And I think that's both its greatest strength and its biggest weakness. Lynch brings such a unique, surreal atmosphere to this world, but at the same time, it clashes with the kind of movie Dune was probably meant to be. I mean, this was supposed to be Star Wars for a more mature audience. A grand, sweeping sci-fi epic with political intrigue, war, and destiny. Instead, it feels like Star Wars if George Lucas had a fever dream and decided to make the whole thing about psychic visions, grotesque body horror, and those whispered internal monologues. Now let's take a moment to talk about some of the moments that really stand out for me, both ones that I loved and ones that made me go, what the hell just happened? So one of the absolute highlights of the film is the introduction of the sandworms. I mean, this is Dune's version of a monster reveal, and it's done with this almost religious awe. The sheer scale of these things, combined with the haunting music, makes them feel like forces of nature, beyond human comprehension. There's this weight to them, the primal fear that really sells the idea that these creatures are at the core of the Arrakis ecosystem and mythology. And say what you will about the film's effects, but the sandworms, they work. They feel massive and dangerous and powerful. Even if everything else in the movie felt disjointed, this is one of the moments where Dune really nails the epic sci-fi feel. And then there's Paul's visions. And look, if you've seen Twin Peaks, you know Lynch loves his cryptic dream sequences. They're unsettling and hypnotic and just slightly off in a way that gets under your skin. And in Dune, these visions are crucial to Paul's journey. They show us glimpses of what's to come, but also leave us feeling like something out of a fever dream. The imagery, the way it's cut together, that's pure Lynch. But the problem? There are just so many of them, and they're not always as effective as they could be. At a certain point, it starts to feel like the movie is leaning on them as a crutch rather than using them as enhancement. And it just gets like, we get it. Paul is seeing the future. Let's move on. I think if these sequences had been more sparingly used, they could have hit harder. All right, we need to talk one more time about the Baron, because the dude is one of the most grotesque villains in sci-fi history. He's not just evil, he's physically repulsive. He's covered in sores, floating around like some kind of bloated hemorrhoid horror movie monster. And while I understand the desire to make him as disturbing as possible, I think they went so far that he became almost cartoonish. I love how over the top he is. He's just oozing sadistic nightmare of a character. And Lynch clearly had a lot of fun making him as revolting as possible. But would a more restrained take have worked better? Maybe, but in a movie that's already so surreal and strange, I think it fits. And of course, we have the final confrontation. This is where the film almost together in a traditional storytelling sense. Paul embraces his destiny, faces off against the villains, and we get the grand operatic climax. Now, it's not perfectly executed. It does feel a little rushed, and the pacing is kind of all over the place. But as a moment, it's still really cool. You can feel the weight of everything that's led up to it, even if the storytelling up to that point had been a little chaotic. But then, just as you're getting into it, the movie ends. And it's not in a satisfying way. It's more of a, wait, that's it kind of way. It's like they realized they were out of time and just wrap things up as quickly as possible. For me, it's super frustrating because the buildup had so much potential, but it just doesn't land the way that it should. So, Dune is not for everyone. Some people see it as a misunderstood masterpiece. Others as an ambitious disaster. I fall somewhere in between the two. I think it is a fascinating and deeply flawed film that was never going to be what audiences wanted in 1984. It's not a traditional blockbuster, and it's definitely not an easy watch, but it's unique, and for that alone, I respect it. So again, for me, it's a 6 out of 10. The moments of brilliance, but also moments of complete incoherence. It's a film that leaves me torn, frustrated by what it could have been, but also still a little impressed by what it dared to be. What about you? Did Lynch's Dune work for you? Do you see it as an underrated gem or a cinematic misfire? Let me know. I want to hear your take too. So where does Dune fit in David Lynch's filmography? Well, honestly, it's the weird outlier, the odd one out. It's like the time your favorite indie band tried to go mainstream, but halfway through the album you can just tell their heart isn't in it. This was Lynch's one big swing at Hollywood blockbuster filmmaking. And if you know anything about Lynch, you know that's just not where he thrives. He's a filmmaker who likes to work in the shadows, in dream logic, and in things that feel personal and surreal. And Dune, for all its ambition, was never really his movie. It was someone else's vision with his name attached. That's not to say it's a failure, far from it. It's visually stunning and the performances are interesting for better and for worse. And it's got that unmistakable Lynchian weirdness, even if it's buried under layers of studio interference and exposition-heavy storytelling. But when you look at what came next, Dune feels like a bit of a detour, a necessary misstep that led Lynch back to where he belonged. Because after this, he goes back to something much smaller, much darker, and much more him. And that brings us to Blue Velvet. If Dune was Lynch trying to play by Hollywood rules, Blue Velvet is him throwing the rule book into a paper shredder and sending it on fire. It's the film that truly defines his style moving forward. Strange, disturbing, personal, and unforgettable. So that's what's next, and I can't wait to dive into it with you. In the meantime, share your thoughts with me. I'm on the socials, on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at Real Talk. Or if you're old school, email me, therealrealtalk@gmail.com. Now, if you like this show, please think about subscribing, liking, leave me a rating or a review. It all helps me, and it helps us grow and expand our conversation. If you like your films a little darker, come check me out on Real Talk Horror Edition. And if you're into fairy tales, come check out Real Talk Grim Edition, where I break down Grimm Brothers fairy tales and what they mean in today's world. But that's going to do it for today. Until next time, remember, film is a dream, and sometimes it's a beautiful one.
Underneath the sun's green gleam, talking reels and all their schemes, dusty scenes and dreams unfold, stories told in shadows bold, gritty plots and whispers tight, dim the streets in moonlight bright. We dissect the cinematic art, real by real we pull apart. The real talk where voices play with velvet words and starlit sway, reviewing tales both light and dark, classic films that leave a mark. Dive deep into celluloid night, critique the legends in our sight. Every frame a layer appeal, truth and intrigue are revealed. Fan the flames of black and white, the mystery dances in the night. Casablanca to the crime, in every score we find a rhyme. from Mars.